Hello there, my name's Card, and here on my YouTube page I like to make little videos about all sorts of different things which interest me. Today specifically, I wanted to talk about the cult classic 1967 soft sci-fi mystery miniseries, The Prisoner. Now, if you don't know the first thing about The Prisoner, but you're still, for some reason, watching this video, you can click away now, if you want. And honestly, I'd recommend finding the series somewhere else online first. And I do believe you can find all of it on YouTube if you look hard enough, but it's definitely out there somewhere at the very least. This is a video primarily for people already familiar with the series, so it won't necessarily make much sense to anyone who hasn't seen it. Also, I will be talking all about the ending and meaning of this mystery show, so consider this a hard spoiler alert for everything from here on out. With that out of the way, in this video, firstly, I'd just like to briefly contextualize the creation of The Prisoner, and just in explaining the context in which it was made and why that'll be important. Then, I want to answer the three big questions the show leaves hanging. Why did number 6 resign? What was up with the ending? And what does this show actually mean? I have answers for all of those questions, and I also think that a lot of the most common theories that the small but dedicated The Prisoner fanbase has historically come up with to answer those three questions have basically all gotten it wrong. And I'd also like to expand on why that is after I give my theories. Now, anyone with even just a passing familiarity with the show could tell you that The Prisoner is essentially about a man with a mysterious background in the British Civil Service, played by the series' creator, writer and primary director, Patrick McGoohan, who inexplicably wakes up in a small seaside resort town under the control of an unknown authority, where he isn't held captive in any traditional sense per se, but he isn't allowed to leave either. The other people in town are all known only by numbers, and it's unclear where anyone's loyalties may lie. But we know one thing for certain. The people most identifiably in charge of the town want McGoohan's character to tell them why he quit his job in the civil service just prior to the start of the series. Anyone who's watched the entire series knows this also ends up becoming one of the audience's biggest questions too. And it might seem that we never actually get a clear answer. However, there is an answer. And the main reason I wanted to make this video, in the hopes that other The Prisoner fans might see it, is because I've never seen anyone else come to this particular set of answers, and what I believe to be the right interpretation of the show and what it all means. To begin, to explain firstly why McGoohan's number 6 character quit his job in the civil service, I do need to get into the production of the Prisoner miniseries and its predecessor, McGoohan's other big hit show, Danger Man. And I'm just going to preempt what some people will already be thinking. McGoohan's character in Danger Man is not the same person as his character in The Prisoner, and I will loop back as to why that explicitly isn't the case later in this video. But for now, it is important to know what Danger Man was in order to know what The Prisoner is about. Please bear with me, just for the sake of making sure everyone's on the same level here. Danger Man was a series McGoohan did before The Prisoner. It starred him, lead role, as an international secret agent field operative type. And crucially, it was pitched as the TV foil to James Bond, which Eon Productions had started developing into a movie franchise a few years prior, and to great success. McGoohan's character in Danger Man, John Drake, essentially had the same job as Bond, but he was strictly by the book about it. No going rogue, no drinking on duty, no seducing the lady side characters, and Drake eschewed guns and violence to the best of his ability. Danger Man's original TV run lasted 2 years as a 20-minute serialized show. Then McGoohan went on a short hiatus, production paused, but eventually he and the powers that be negotiated a second run of the show with double the runtime and a bigger budget per episode, which meant Danger Man ended up getting another 4 years. During this second run, it really took off. The late 60s was really big on spy fiction, and a lot of different TV shows and movie franchises all did their own spin on the basic premise. But McGoohan's performance in Danger Man really stuck out in particular. Audiences evidently really liked having a version of the general spy premise that was slower and a bit more subtle than a lot of its other contemporaries, because Danger Man did end up becoming a really big hit in its own right. By 1966, McGoohan was the single highest paid performer on British television, and definitely one of the most recognisable. It's fair to say McGoohan was one of the first celebrities who made their name solely in television. But after having been doing Danger Man for all these years, while at the height of the series' popularity, McGoohan said he'd thought they'd done enough with the show and he stepped away from it. The show can't really go on when it's so closely tied to its superstar leading man, so Danger Man ended. No hard feelings among anyone on the production side, just McGoohan thought it was a good time to wrap things up. Now, when the final season of Danger Man eventually finished airing and it was announced that there wouldn't be any more, the fan base didn't take it well. We might think of the whole petulant fans getting all up in arms about the endings of their shows thing to be a modern post-internet phenomenon. But it really has been going on for about as long as the public has been consuming fiction. Famously, the first time Arthur Conan Doyle tried killing off Sherlock Holmes, there was a big uproar about it, and that was in 1893. Anyway, the point is, people reacted badly to the ending of Danger Man. And since McGoohan calling it quits was the reason the show had to stop, a lot of his supposed biggest fans got really mad at him. They wrote thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of angry letters to the studio. They started showing up outside his house and making a scene, and demanded that he kept the series going. All really over-the-top stuff. It would have been perfectly understandable if McGoohan, seeing all this, would have sworn off acting in public life altogether after that. But instead, he ends up taking another little hiatus break, and he comes back ready to pitch this idea for a new spy miniseries he's already got half a dozen episodes more or less written for. This is the show that will end up becoming The Prisoner, and the central premise involves a concept he learnt about while doing Danger Man. That is, during the Second World War and the latent Cold War up to that point, every once in a while the Western Allies would get a high-level scientist or an engineer or a bureaucrat or similar who defected from either the Nazis during the war or the Soviets afterwards. And when you get someone like that who wants to come over to your side, you need somewhere to physically put them, for one thing. And these sorts of people aren't prisoners of war exactly, but you also need to keep them out of the way somewhere while you find out what they know. So what the British government in particular did when this started to become something they'd have to deal with is that they basically used eminent domain to take possession of a few big old disused country estates up in the north, and they converted the manors and the grounds into simple living spaces for high-level defectors who'd made it into the country. Danger Man had done an episode centered around one of these sorts of institutions, which they'd filmed in and around a small Welsh resort town called Portmeirion, and McGoohan wanted his new show to explore the same general concept. And he and the studio he was with were still welcome to go back and film at the same small town, so that's what they ended up doing. Again, I will stress here, McGowan's characters in Danger Man and the prisoner are not the same person. But I say all this so I can finally get into what the prisoner means. Now, since so much of what happens in The Prisoner is very abstract, characters are rarely honest, and even most of the broadcast order isn't even in a proper linear sequence, it's no surprise that ever since the show first came out, that people have been trying to figure out what it all really means. The most common interpretation that seems to get bandied around viewers is that the mysterious village represents society at large and that McGowan is trying to convey some sort of fairly individualistic social message about not wanting to be controlled by unaccountable bureaucratic forces. The problem is, that explanation doesn't actually do anything to get into the substance of the show, and throwing your hands up and saying the real villain of the piece is society is such a hack move. You honestly should expect better media literacy from a high school English class. So if you consider yourself a big fan of The Prisoner, and your main takeaway of the show is that it's a generic criticism of modernizing society or surveillance technologies or whatever, then you have no real idea of how to get into the subtext of a work. Plus, if you really want a properly satisfying answer to the question of what is this show supposed to be about, you need to drill deeper than just saying number 6 doesn't like living in this overbearing society. I, for one, would sooner suggest, if you'll continue to bear with me here, the plot of The Prisoner, if you can call it an allegory for anything, it's one big extended metaphor for the public reaction to the ending of Danger Man. Number 6 isn't the same character as John Drake, literally, but Number 6's leaving his job is a stand-in for McGowan deciding to walk away from doing Danger Man. Each Number 2 is essentially a Danger Man fan who demands answers as to why the show had to end, and who feels entitled to either a comprehensive answer or for McGowan to go back to doing his old show. When Patrick McGowan, in real life, stopped doing Danger Man, he told his bosses, he told the press, he told his fans very plainly. He just thought they'd done enough and it was time to wrap things up. But still, his fans got pissy and demanded to know the real reason, to the point where they were even showing up to McGowan's home and the old Danger Man studio and making a ruckus. It tracks with the way that in The Prisoner, in Arrival, the first episode, Number 6 was initially cooperative and largely happy to just tell the original Number 2 that he'd simply had enough of his civil service job and wanted to walk away quietly. In 6's first meeting with Number 2, he goes so far as to answer a bunch of other seemingly inconsequential questions like how he takes his tea and what his date of birth is, which, for what it's worth, Number 6 gives as the 19th of March, 1928, the exact same day of McGowan's real-life birth, further cluing you into the fact early that the character is representative of the actor playing him. And despite his confusion at suddenly waking up in an unfamiliar place and being asked all these probing questions, Number 6 does answer a lot of these initial questions very amicably, all things considered, to the point where he's even said the reason he walked out of his old job, and it was just that he'd had enough. Now that's a perfectly good enough answer, and it does essentially answer the question. But what a lot of people who watch this series once miss is that Number 6 didn't refuse to tell his captors why he quit. He did right away the first time, and they ignored it. Later on, towards the end of the first episode, the original Number 2 takes 6 into the Labour Exchange Office for another round of questioning. And it's only then that McGowan starts getting fed up with all the incessant questions, when now he's being asked for a comprehensive review of what he likes to read, what he likes to eat, personal aspirations, family illnesses, religion, politics, all that sort of stuff, that shouldn't be germane to finding out why he quit his job. By the end of the episode, number 6 is getting called into the office of a new number 2 who just asks all the same questions as his predecessor, which is where McGowan's character finally snaps at him and practically says, "I wasn't the one to make a big fuss out of quitting. I simply finished my job and left on peaceful terms, but you lot won't take that as an answer." And keep this in particular in mind for the rest of the video. It'll become important again later. Everything you really need to decode The Prisoner is virtually right there in the first episode. It's no surprise then the only episodes with an established, concrete place in the chronological order of the series is that first episode and the two-parter finale. Not to disparage the rest of the series, but the only reason there even are another 14 episodes in there between the start and the end is because McGowan and co. needed to pitch at least one season's worth of stories to a network to get the show made and broadcast. I hate to burst the bubble of anyone who is reading The Prisoner as some really deep critique of the proto-security state surveillance tech or anything, but it's actually an allegory for one man's annoyance at inadvertently becoming one of the first real media celebrities and then copping a bunch of intrusive 60s fanboy backlash for quitting his star-making role. So that's what the show was about. I hope that cleared some things up for you if you watched it at some point and have been wondering for some time since. And just to reiterate, the rights to the character McGowan played in Danger Man are also held by an entirely different IP holder. So John Drake and number 6 legally can't be the same person for royalties reasons, if nothing else. And really, to think that they could be, or that they should be, or to continue to think that McGowan should have done a sequel to Danger Man, is to entirely miss the point of The Prisoner as well. He doesn't want to keep doing the same role forever, and he's given you a real simple answer as to why, too. Even though people don't listen, and they're not even really entitled to any deeper explanations anyway. All that said, there's still two major The Prisoner-related things I wanted to go through. Firstly, what was up with the weird ending? So, the premise of the finale two-parter, if you'll recall, the village's overseers bring back one of the previous number 2s, played by Leo McKern, who personally forces number 6 to undergo a really intense, regressive psychodrama experience in a replica boarding school classroom with him. Then, when that doesn't accomplish anything, there's a big underground ceremony with an old-timey British judge and a gallery of masked figures who all congratulate number 6 and tell him he's great. On your first viewing of the series, you'll no doubt probably have a few questions about exactly what it is meant to be in service of. But at the end of the day, the big ploy of the final 2 episodes aren't really anything all that special. They're definitely big and elaborate and weird, but the whole mocked-up classroom thing in the penultimate Once Upon a Time and the underground cavern ceremony in the finale Fallout aren't necessarily the village's final means of breaking number 6. They're not even the most complicated or outlandish things we've seen a number 2 try, compared to what we've already seen in the series up to that point. The chimes of Big Ben showed that it was well within the village's means to have a whole replica of McGowan's old office built. Living in Harmony had a whole Wild West set done up that fooled number 6 for days. And the Schizoid Man demonstrated that the powers that be have at least one number 6 lookalike on staff too. It just so happens that by the events of the finale, Fallout, number 6 has long had enough, and he sees his opportunity, so he grabs a gun and a truck and makes his escape. People who have seen the entire series always seem to end up ascribing far too much weight to the events of those last 2 episodes, up to the point where McGowan breaks out. Both the week-long intensive boarding school setup and the big underground presentation ceremony afterwards shouldn't be thought of as any more revealing or real than any other elaborate ploy the village has tried before. Aside from the fact number 6 makes his breakout during the finale, the actual premise of the final 2 episode setup isn't actually anything inherently special. They just so happen to be the last 2. Really, you could have swapped out the ceremony in the finale with just about any other episode's plot, just so long as McGowan still plausibly has a way to grab a gun and drive off by the end of it. And speaking of the show's ending, there is one other major point I wanted to make regarding The Prisoner and how to interpret it. It's something I've been thinking over the implications of for a while now, ever since I did a full rewatch last year. And it's also something that I've gone looking to see if anyone else has said, because The Prisoner has been around for close to 60 years now, and really especially since the advent of the internet, there's been a sizable fan community out there that like discussing it and theorizing about what it all means. But I haven't seen anyone else out there suggest, as I will, that actually the entirety of that iconic opening sequence we see at the start of the show actually takes place after the series, not before it. If you're familiar with the show, to the extent I imagine anyone ever watching this will be, then no doubt you'll recall that fantastic opening. In the very first episode of The Prisoner, right at the start, we get an almost 3-minute long sequence where, without any dialogue, you see McGowan's character drive into London, kick down the doors of presumably his boss's office, slam down an envelope, you see a close-up of his file getting crossed out and put in the resigned drawer, and he heads back to his apartment to get gassed unconscious. Almost every subsequent episode, save for the finale and the one Wild West one-off, uses a slightly cut-down version of the same intro with a bit of voiceover from whoever's playing the number 2 that episode. And it's become iconic in its own right for good reason. It's very good. However, I believe that many people, even many people who have seen the series multiple times and who consider themselves big The Prisoner fans, really misconstrue what they see in that introduction. It's definitely implied that everything we see prior to the title card of the first episode is the resignation from the civil service that the village wants answers about. But I think it's clear that by the time you've watched every episode, the whole thing is drastically recontextualized, and it becomes clear that that's not actually the case. For one thing, during that first meeting between number 6 and the original number 2 I mentioned earlier, we hear pretty clearly that 6's resignation was a discreet and low-profile thing that he kept his reasons for, obviously, to himself. That's your first hint regarding the dramatic barging into someone's office we see in the intro wasn't the resignation that happened prior to the series. Once you realize that, everything else starts lining up too. Like how in that intro sequence, McGowan is driving his snazzy little Lotus kit car and he's wearing an all-black button-up shirt, trousers, and blazer outfit. Of course, during the show's run, he doesn't have access to his car in the village. And by the end of the first episode, his original clothes, that all-black outfit he shows up in the village wearing, are confiscated from him and he's told they're burnt. But again, during the events of the final episode, Fallout, it turns out that that too was a lie, and McGowan gets his black shirt and trousers and blazer back, and he's able to ditch the white piping rowing club outfit he spent most of the show's run wearing. So by the end of the series, by the time number 6 finally breaks out of the village, he's comfortably back in his starting outfit. And let's not forget, in the final few scenes of Fallout, McGowan, alongside the butler, Angelo Muscat, swings by his old apartment and number 6 gets in his old car. then the very final shot of the series as a whole, before the credits roll for the final time, is McGowan speeding down the motorway exactly as he does at the start of the first episode's opening sequence, complete with that rumbling thunder sound effect over the top. As the show ends, Number 6 is on his way to go and do everything that was portrayed in Arrival prior to the title card. He's about to go burst into someone's office and shouting and slam down an envelope saying, "You want answers? Here's your comprehensive reason why I quit." That next shot of his file going into the resigned bin isn't from when he first walked out. It's from now that he's gone back and loudly made it clear to the powers that be that he's definitely out. Number 6's resignation is only now well and truly finalized for good. And the fact that this chronologically last scene plays before we get properly into the first episode of the series ties back into the meaning of the show itself and why it was made. Because this show, The Prisoner, is in effect McGowan, the real-world actor, doubling down on his resignation from Danger Man. When his fanbase couldn't accept he'd left his old role and kept seriously harassing him about it, McGowan made The Prisoner to drive home the message that he wasn't going back, and he absolutely doesn't care for the people badgering him to do so or incessantly asking him why he left in the first place. In effect, you, the viewer, particularly the contemporary 1967 Danger Man fanboy viewer, are receiving a loud and clear resignation from Patrick McGowan. Eagerly watching The Prisoner is essentially the same as reading the contents of that envelope Number 6 throws onto the desk of his old boss, to make a metatextual metaphorical connection here. By the time you're done watching all 17 episodes of the series, do you finally understand that he shouldn't be harangued into returning to his old show? In the end, did that message sink into the general public? Unfortunately, I'd have to say that with our 60 years of retrospect, probably not. Because, guess what? Once The Prisoner finished airing its original run in the UK, if anything, the McGowan fanboys got even weirder about things, and more people than ever started showing up to the man's house and the studio demanding answers, to the point where McGowan even felt the need to leave the country for a while for his own safety and well-being. From then on, Patrick McGowan tried to avoid the public eye as best he could. The man who had at one point arguably been the most recognizable man on television swore off leading any other big TV project. He basically retired then and there, popping up only occasionally to take a few minor roles in movies and theatrical projects which personally interested him, and of course guest starring a handful of times in Columbo just as a favour for his good friend Peter Falk. So, in the end, that's basically the big takeaway you should have about the series. As a piece of art or as a text, it's about a creator being harassed by his fans. But it's being expressed as this sci-fi psychodrama set in this quaint little seaside resort town, and like any text, you can't properly drill down into the meaning if you get too hung up on just the surface level events of the fictional storyline. Incidentally, this also means, I would argue, the series can't ever really be properly adapted if the person adapting it doesn't understand that message the original series was trying to convey. And even then, the message might just be too tied to McGowan's own personal experiences to be properly captured by someone else trying to just adapt the setting or the aesthetics of the original. And people have tried. There was a pretty poorly received reboot attempted around 2009 with Jim Caviezel and Ian McKellen that didn't last too long, and a few other people have attempted comic book lines and a radio play adaptation. But frankly, a lot of old media products don't need to be remade, and The Prisoner is definitely one of them. That's all I really wanted to say today. But, just as an addendum, if you're a big The Prisoner fan who's still here with me, there is one other minor question the show sort of leaves hanging that I might as well wrap up while I'm on the topic. As I mentioned, the 17 episodes of The Prisoner, by and large, don't have a definitive official order. We know which one comes first and which two are last, but apart from that, the original UK broadcast order, the international broadcast order, and all of the home media release orders are all different and are all basically completely arbitrary. You can watch the series in any of those orders, or at complete random, and still have the same general experience of the show. But of course, plenty of die-hard The Prisoner fans out there have tried to figure out a coherent timeline and put forward their own theories on that. This arguably misses the point about not getting too invested in these shows, but I might as well share my watch order while I'm doing this as well, because I do have one, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't put some thought into it myself. If you care, here's my episode order, and I'll quickly explain how I justify it. The way I see it, the biggest thing to take into consideration when trying to figure out the timeline here is how number 6 is characterized. Putting the episodes like this essentially divides the series into 3 narrative arcs. Here, in the first 5 or so episodes, number 6 is relatively passive towards the authority figures of the village, and his efforts to spoil their attempts to mess with him are all fairly reactive, and the plots themselves are all pretty straightforward. Plus, we can make some inferences about how long number 6 has been around for in these episodes by how a lot of village life still seems strange to him here. I, for one, like having the chimes of Big Ben second in the series, if only because there's a nice symmetry there in having Leo McKern, that episode's number 2, be both the first new number 2 introduced after the pilot, show up in the second episode, since he'll later come back as the final new number 2 in the series' second last episode. Dance of the Dead makes for a good third episode because it keeps up the early tone of McGowan being really powerless to stop the powers that be from messing with him. Plus, during this episode, number 6 explicitly mentions to another character that he hasn't been in the village all that long by this point. Then, I put The General and A, B, and C next one after another because they are a rare explicit example of this show having a direct continuity between 2 episodes in that they share the same number 2, Colin Gordon. And there's a background subplot which runs throughout these 2 episodes wherein whoever number 2 answers to wants efforts to subdue number 6 to drastically step up and start getting some results in their eyes. That directly leads into the middle chunk of episodes, all of which are arguably some of the strongest standalone stories of the series also, where the villagers' schemes all get decidedly bolder, and a lot of the number 2s are played by their respective actors and actresses as a lot more aggressive and willing to use increasingly severe means. Also, in all these episodes, number 6 starts to come across as far more familiar with how the village operates. He's more at ease even just navigating the place, and you do see him talk with more of the other minor numbered characters out and about and use the local facilities and so on. By this point, number 6 is also much more successful at properly resisting however the village is trying to mess with him from episode to episode. In episodes like Free for All and It's Your Funeral, number 6 is much more savvy to how the mind games of the village work, but it does still occasionally get him burnt, and he makes a serious mistake here and there, like at the end of Many Happy Returns or Checkmate or The Schizoid Man. This leaves the final few episodes before the 2-part finale as the place to put the really big, desperate ploys that number 6 is subject to. But it's also worth noting that in a lot of these bigger, arguably sillier episodes, like Living in Harmony and Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, by this point number 6 is consistently seeing through and foiling the plans of these later number 2s. In fact, by the end of The Girl Who Was Death and all throughout Hammer into Anvil, number 6 is now actively fucking with his captors instead of the other way round, which makes them a good crescendo point for the show before the big finale. Strictly speaking, you can watch the series in any order. But my big problem with that is that it means you're jumping all over the place in terms of how well number 6 seems to do against the villain of the week. But with an order like mine, for instance, you do end up getting a sense of progress and character growth as the show goes on. At the end of the day, it's not important. It's just a bunch of ideas I've been sitting on for a while, and I wanted to share in one way or another. If you too are a fan of The Prisoner, and you've listened to this all the way through, thank you for that. And if you might like to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or just take a look at my other videos. If you're into a lot of cult classic sci-fi and what it means, you might be interested in particular in a couple of videos I've done about the various adaptations of The War of the Worlds and The Planet of the Apes, which I trust you can find on my page. Once again, my name's Card. Goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.